Right, okay, so we're going to start thinking about where data comes from in public health by having a couple of short lectures on epidemiology. Moving on. Yeah, so we'll talk about what it is, and necessarily we'll talk about the nature of scientific proof and talk about theories and hypotheses and use the hygiene hypothesis as an example of how epidemiological information is collected and used. Okay, so epidemiology, a word that has been much in the news in recent times. As well as infectious diseases such as the coronavirus, these models also apply to non-infectious issues such as type 2 diabetes. There's a definition. The principle and rule are key to understanding the importance of epidemiology, so they're worth mentioning here. The principle, health problems are not distributed randomly in populations. They have specific causes and do affect specific groups differently. And the role of epidemiology is to provide information to help control these health issues and to mitigate them. In science, it's not appropriate to say that X causes Y. Given appropriate evidence, it's much more appropriate to use phrases like there is evidence that X is associated with an increased or decreased rate of Y in a relevant population. Not the whole population. An individual is sample size n equals 1, and that is anecdote, not evidence. Okay, so a couple of phrases there. We'll come back to etiology in a little while. Causal inference is a process of drawing conclusions about a causal connection based on how conditions influence the occurrence of an effect. Note, it's an inference, which relates to what I said a bit earlier, and we never say that X causes Y. Yeah, there's no such thing as scientific proof. Similarly, we'd never say things like scientists have proved or disproved something or other. So we don't want to see that in your reports, particularly on your project reports next year. There may be evidence to support a particular proposition, which is fine, but it's not the same as proof. Proofs only exist in mathematics and logic. Most of our understanding of science is based on theories, an often misused term. See this scientific American link for some background. A scientific theory is an explanation of an aspect of the natural world which can be repeatedly tested and verified in accordance with a scientific method, using accepted protocols of observation. The key word here is explanation. Now, there are scientific laws, and that might sound more rigorous, but though the consequences of gravity, for example, are well understood, how it works is something of a mystery still, a considerable mystery actually. On the other hand, evolution is a theory supported by a gigantic body of evidence, but also supported by a very good understanding of how it works. So hypotheses. We've talked about hypotheses quite a lot, certainly with the first students. A hypothesis is an educated guess about what you think will happen in a scientific experiment based on your observations. Before conducting that experiment, you propose a hypothesis so you can determine if your prediction is supported. So here's a hypothesis. The moon is made out of green cheese. It's important to notice that both theories and hypotheses can be supported or refuted by evidence. Now, we know from studies of orbital mechanics that the moon is not made out of cheese, and this was confirmed when Armstrong and Aldrin landed at Tranquility Base. Google used to have a Google map of the moon which is made out of cheese, which was not particularly helpful, if slightly amusing. So here's an example of a hypothesis developing our understanding of a key issue, the hygiene hypothesis, which relate to things like asthma. Asthma is a common lung condition that causes occasional breathing difficulties, which may be serious in some cases. It affects people of all ages and often starts in childhood, typically in adolescence, though it can develop for the first time in adults. It's associated with the immune system, as many of these things are, and may in some cases cause serious problems. Some data on asthma in the UK. Asthma UK, the charity, has quite a lot of further information if you're interested in this for a project, for example. And there's lots of data worldwide collected by people like, for example, the World Health Organization. So we'll notice the orange and red, relatively high amounts. Blue, low amounts, and lots of grey areas. When this was done, which is a while back, it has to be said, probably need to look for more recent data on this. Lots of areas, including big countries like the United States and Canada, where information is not being collected. which is sort of interesting. Somehow doubt much has been collected in the past few years in America. Here's an interesting population level effect. With the fall of the Soviet Union, East Germany and West Germany unified to form the reunited nation of Germany in 1990. There were significant economic differences between the West and the much less affluent East. Historically, the West also had much higher rates of asthma, but post-unification, the rate of asthma increased in the East, and is possibly associated with increased affluence. See the link for an abstract for more reading if you're interested. Okay, get back to the hygiene hypothesis. This is the original hygiene hypothesis as stated by Strachan in 1989. So you can have a read of that, pause a video on the presentation. It refers to atopic diseases, which would include things like eczema, asthma, rhinoconjunctivitis, so an eye irritation. These are clinical syndromes, each defined by a group of symptoms and signs. You see this sort of nomenclature used. So that's the sort of high or possibly lower level summary of the hygiene hypothesis. Are we too clean for our own good? Now, the causal inference being drawn here is that a lower incidence of childhood infections is associated with a rise in allergies. And I say this is often paraphrased as, are we too clean for our own good? Back in human history, cleanliness wasn't a big focus, shall we say. They didn't have anything like this. It is worth noting, however, that life expectancy was very short indeed. This fellow there with club, which may be about to make his life expectancy a bit shorter. Who knows? For most of human history, we have lived rather short lives by modern standards, and this was a key factor in slow population growth across the world, which even went backwards when the Black Death in Europe killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. From the late 18th century, the human population has grown considerably, such that even 2 world wars in which around 80 million people died in the 20th century only slowed the rate of growth. The rapid growth is associated with a number of factors: the rise of science, the Industrial Revolution that followed, and perhaps the biggest factor, clean water supplies. And we'll talk about that a little more when we talk about Jon Snow in a future lecture. These have been identified as the most important factors: improved housing, improved nutrition, and improved hygiene, indoor plumbing, clean water. And again, there's some good links there if you're interested in this from point of view of background reading or a future project. This is an interesting aside. Pig farmers are habitually exposed to pigworms and have a much lower rate of Crohn's disease, a type of inflammatory bowel disease. Pigworms are a type of helminth, which is a general term, includes a wide range of worms. See the link for more on helminthic treatment of Crohn's disease. It's also, Crohn's disease also is an issue in countries like Gambia, where 99% of the population carry these worms without doing any great harm. They're not like tapeworms, which are quite seriously detrimental to health. Okay, so back to the hygiene hypothesis. Some quotes from the media of varying reliability, shall we say. The current model has now moved on the original hygiene hypothesis based on the development evidence. So we'll talk about that now. The paper linked here is worth a read if you're interested in this. It notes that although the hygiene hypothesis is supported by epidemiological research of allergenic diseases in certain industrialised settings, it often fails to explain the incidence of asthma in less affluent regions of the world. It doesn't explain the effect or not effect of farms, in particular, and the effect of urbanisation. This is a summary of projective and risk factors from asthma. Maybe should have had this a little bit earlier on, but just points out it's a complex web of interrelated factors. And with all these things, it becomes quite hard to figure out what's going on, particularly when you're looking at relatively small populations, which many of these studies are done on. New data suggests the altered exposure results from measures vital to protecting us from infectious diseases, but which are inadvertently reduced or altered exposure to the microbial friends that regulate our immune system. These include food and water quality, sanitation, environmental cleanliness, together with medical advances such as antibiotic usage. And we can say that, as a summary, good microbes are essential. This is a review of the evidence. I'm not going to go through it. You can pause the video, you can have a read of it yourself. But this is where the evidence stands at the moment. Again, another definition there, which many of you I'm sure have come across: common cell bacteria, part of the normal bacterial flora of humans. So, for example, the bacterial flora which populates our guts and our mouth. Not so much the skin, which is quite a lot of this, but the gastrointestinal tract in general is most important here. So we can say the original hygiene hypothesis has been largely discounted now. And we moved on to the old friends hypothesis. In 2003, Rook proposed the old friends hypothesis, which has been described as a more rational explanation for the links between microbial exposure and inflammatory disorders. In this case, the hypothesis states that vital microbial exposures are not common childhood infections, but rather the microbes already present during mammalian and human evolution. He proposed that co-evolution with these species has resulted in their having a role in immune system development. Again, it's a hypothesis, and more work will have to be done. Okay, so that's all for the first part.